The morning Frank Lawson pulled his wife's wedding ring from the bottom of their bone-dry well, he finally understood that some silences don't just echo, they swallow everything whole. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the Iowa dawn at 4:47 a.m., but Frank Lawson was already awake, staring at the water stain on the bedroom ceiling that looked like a question mark. 3 weeks since Mary Ann had driven away in their rusted Chevy, and the house still held the ghost of her morning coffee ritual. The way she'd tap the spoon against the ceramic mug twice, always twice, before setting it in the sink with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of their 22-year marriage. The floorboards groaned under his bare feet as he padded to the kitchen window. Outside, the cornfield stretched toward the horizon like a carpet of brittle promises, the stalks bent and yellowing under the relentless August sun. The drought had been merciless this year, turning their 200 acres into a monument to failed hope. But it was the silence that cut deepest. No hum of conversation over breakfast, no gentle scolding as the kids dragged their feet getting ready for school, no warm body next to his in the pre-dawn darkness. "Dad." The voice belonged to Tommy, his 16-year-old son, who stood in the doorway wearing yesterday's clothes and the hollow expression that had become his default since his mother left. The boy had grown 3 inches this summer, but somehow seemed smaller, as if abandonment had a way of shrinking people from the inside out. "Morning, son." Frank's voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by weeks of swallowing words he couldn't say. "Sarah up yet?" Tommy shrugged, that universal teenage gesture that meant everything and nothing. "She's in the barn again, drawing those birds." Sarah, 13 years old and suddenly obsessed with sketching the crows that gathered around their property like mourners at a funeral. She'd taken to spending hours in the old dairy barn, her charcoal pencils creating dark wings on white paper, as if she could capture something about flight that the rest of them had forgotten. Frank poured lukewarm coffee from yesterday's pot, the bitter liquid coating his throat like regret. Through the window, he could see the old windmill's blades turning lazily in the morning breeze, pumping nothing but air from the well that had sustained 4 generations of Lawsons. The irony wasn't lost on him, a farm built on water, dying of thirst. "The Hendersons called last night," Tommy said, his voice careful, measured. "Said they'd buy the South 40 if we're interested in selling." The words hung in the kitchen air like smoke. The South 40, the richest soil on the property, where Frank's grandfather had planted the first corn crop in 1952. Where Frank had proposed to Mary Ann under the old oak tree, her yes floating on the evening breeze like a prayer answered. "We're not selling," Frank said, the words coming out harder than he'd intended. Tommy flinched, and Frank immediately regretted the sharpness, but pride kept him from softening it. The boy nodded and disappeared back upstairs, leaving Frank alone with his cold coffee and the sound of his own breathing. He pressed his palms against the kitchen counter, feeling the worn laminate beneath his fingers, the same counter where Mary Ann had hidden the unpaid bills in an old coffee tin, each envelope a small defeat she tried to spare him from seeing. Outside, the sun climbed higher, turning the drought-stricken fields into a shimmering mirage of what used to be. The well stood in the center of the farmyard like a tombstone, its hand-pump handle gleaming in the morning light. For generations of Lawsons had drawn water from those depths. 4 generations had trusted that the earth would provide. Frank walked to the back porch, where Mary Ann's herb garden had withered to brown stubs in terracotta pots. He'd been meaning to water them, but every time he picked up the hose, he heard her voice telling him exactly how much each plant needed, exactly when to water, exactly how to care for growing things. Without her instructions, he'd let them die rather than risk doing it wrong. The screen door creaked as Sarah emerged from the barn, her sketch pad clutched against her chest like armor. She looked so much like her mother at that age, the same stubborn chin, the same way of holding her head when she was thinking. But where Mary Ann had been full of words, Sarah had grown increasingly quiet, as if she'd inherited her mother's absence along with her features. "Find any good ones today?" Frank asked, nodding toward her drawings. Sarah paused, considering whether to trust him with an answer. Finally, she opened the pad to reveal a charcoal sketch of a single crow perched on a fence post, its eyes fixed on something beyond the frame. "They're not leaving," she said quietly. "Even with the drought. Even with no water. They're still here." Frank studied the drawing, noting the careful attention to detail, the way the bird's feathers caught the light, the intelligence in its dark eyes, the slight tilt of its head that suggested it was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. "Maybe they know something we don't," he said. Sarah almost smiled, the first time he'd seen even the hint of one since her mother left. "Maybe." As she disappeared into the house, Frank found himself walking toward the well, drawn by something he couldn't name. The metal bucket sat beside it, filled with nothing but dust and disappointment from yesterday's failed attempt to draw water. He gripped the pump handle and worked it up and down, the mechanical rhythm a familiar comfort even as it produced nothing but the hollow wheeze of empty pipes. The sun beat down on his shoulders as he stared into the well's dark mouth. Somewhere in those depths lay the source that had sustained his family for generations. Somewhere in that darkness, water still waited. He had to believe that. Because if the well was truly dry, if the earth had finally given up on them, then maybe Mary Ann had been right to leave. Maybe there was nothing left here worth fighting for. But as he stood there in the growing heat, listening to the wind move through the dying corn, Frank felt something shift inside him. Not hope, exactly, but something harder, more stubborn. A refusal to accept that this was the end of the story. The well might be dry, the crops might be failing, and his wife might be gone, but the land was still here. His children were still here. And sometimes that had to be enough to start with. That evening, Frank sat alone on the front porch, Mary Ann's wedding ring balanced on his palm like a question he couldn't answer. The water sample from the well sat on the table beside him, murky and uninviting but proof that the land hadn't completely given up on them. Tommy was inside, researching water filtration systems on the old desktop computer, while Sarah sketched in her room by lamplight. The ring caught the last light of the sunset, its tarnished gold surface telling a story he wasn't sure he wanted to read. How long had Mary Ann been planning to leave? How many mornings had she stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the failing crops and feeling the weight of this band around her finger like a chain? When she'd finally thrown it into the well, had it been an act of anger or relief? Frank turned it over in his palm, remembering the day he'd bought it from Jensen's Jewelry in Cedar Rapids. He'd been 24 years old and so nervous he'd stuttered when asking to see the rings. Mary Ann had been working at the bank then, and he'd been a young farmer trying to prove he could make something of his grandfather's land. The ring had cost him 3 months' profit from the soybean harvest, but he'd never regretted it. Not until now. "Dad." Sarah appeared beside him, her sketch pad tucked under her arm. She'd inherited her mother's ability to move quietly, to appear when you needed her most without being summoned. "Shouldn't you be getting ready for bed?" he asked, though he made no move to put the ring away. Sarah settled into the chair that had been her mother's favorite, the one with the view of the herb garden and the old oak tree. "Couldn't sleep. Too much thinking." Frank nodded, understanding. Sleep had become elusive for all of them since Mary Ann left, as if the house itself was too restless to settle into nighttime quiet. "What's that?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the ring. Frank hesitated, then opened his palm to show her. "Found it in the well today. Your mother's." Sarah leaned forward, studying the ring with the same careful attention she gave to her drawings. "She threw it away?" "Looks like it." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the last fireflies of summer blink across the farmyard. In the distance, Frank could hear the Hendersons' irrigation system running, the sound of water hitting dry earth like a promise he couldn't make to his own crops. "I have something too," Sarah said quietly. She opened her sketch pad and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Found it in Mom's dresser drawer when I was looking for... Well, it doesn't matter what I was looking for." Frank took the paper, recognizing Mary Ann's handwriting immediately. It was a letter, addressed to him but never sent, dated 3 months ago. "Frank, I know you'll never understand why I had to leave, and maybe that's my fault for never finding the words to explain it while I was still brave enough to try. It's not the farm that's failing, it's me. I wake up every morning feeling like I'm drowning in the silence, in the weight of pretending everything is fine when the bills keep coming and the rain keeps not falling, and I can't remember the last time we talked about anything except what needed to be fixed or planted or harvested. I keep thinking about the well, how deep it goes, how it's always been there providing for us even when we took it for granted. But what happens when the well runs dry? What happens when the thing that's always sustained you finally gives up? I used to think love was like that well, deep enough to last forever, reliable enough to build a life on. But love needs tending too, doesn't it? It needs rain and attention and the faith that tomorrow will be better than today. I'm not leaving because I don't love you. I'm leaving because I do, and I can't watch us turn into strangers living in the same house, going through the motions of a marriage that died somewhere between the drought and the debt and all the things we stopped saying to each other. Maybe some distance will help us remember who we used to be before we became people who only talked about survival. I'm taking the truck and some clothes, but I'm leaving my ring behind. Not because it doesn't mean anything, but because it means too much to carry with me while I figure out how to be a person again instead of just half of something that's broken. The letter ended there, unsigned, as if she'd run out of courage before she could finish it. Frank read it twice, then a third time, feeling each word like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond the initial impact. "She didn't abandon us," Sarah said quietly. "She got lost." Frank looked at his daughter, struck by the wisdom in her 13-year-old voice. "When did you get so smart?" "Mom used to say I got it from you. The stubborn kind of smart that won't give up even when giving up makes more sense." Frank laughed, the sound rough and unexpected in the evening air. "Your mother always was too generous with her compliments." "She loves you," Sarah said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "The letter proves it. She wouldn't have written it if she didn't love you." Frank folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Sarah. "Then why didn't she send it?" "Maybe she was afraid you wouldn't understand. Maybe she was afraid you'd try to fix it instead of letting her figure out how to fix herself." The words hit Frank like a physical blow, because he recognized the truth in them. He was a fixer by nature, a man who believed every problem had a solution if you were willing to work hard enough to find it. But you couldn't fix a person the way you fixed a broken fence or a failing crop. People had to do their own healing, find their own way back to wholeness. "The ring," he said, holding it up to catch the last light. "She threw it in the well because she couldn't bear to take it with her." "Or because she knew you'd find it eventually," Sarah said. "You always find things that are lost. Remember when I lost my favorite pencil in the cornfield? You spent 3 hours looking for it." Frank remembered. Sarah had been 8 years old and inconsolable over the loss of a cheap mechanical pencil that had somehow become precious to her. He'd walked every row of corn until he'd found it, bent and dirty but salvageable. She'd hugged him like he'd recovered buried treasure. "Some things are worth looking for," he said. "Some people are worth looking for too," Sarah replied. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the farm. The corn rustled in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called out across the fields. Frank thought about the water he'd found in the well, dirty and limited but real. He thought about the letter, full of pain but also full of love. He thought about his daughter's drawings of birds that refused to leave even when the landscape could no longer sustain them. "Sarah," he said finally, "what do you think about taking a drive tomorrow? Maybe see if we can find your mother." Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face from careful teenager back to the little girl who believed her father could find anything that was lost. "I think that sounds like something Mom would call the stubborn kind of smart." Frank slipped the ring into his shirt pocket, where it rested against his heart like a compass pointing toward something he'd thought was lost forever. The well might be nearly dry, but it had given up its secrets. The land might be struggling, but it was still capable of sustaining life. And sometimes, nearly dry was enough to start digging again. Old elm tree, watching the shallow water move over smooth stones that had been worn down by years of current and persistence. When Marianne finally appeared, she traded her work apron for a cardigan that he recognized as one she'd left behind, brought to her by Sarah during one of their mother-daughter phone calls that he'd pretended not to overhear. They walked to the bridge without speaking, their footsteps hollow on the wooden planks. Below them, the creek ran clear and steady, fed by underground springs that had survived the drought. Frank thought about the water he'd found in their well, how it had taken descending into darkness to discover what remained. "You got my letter," Marianne said finally, not quite a question. "Sarah found it. Read it to me on the front porch while I was trying to figure out what to do with this." He pulled her wedding ring from his pocket, holding it out in his palm like an offering. Marianne stared at the ring, her eyes filling with tears she'd been holding back for months. "I threw it away. I thought if I could just let go of the symbol, maybe the pain would follow." "The well kept it safe," Frank said. "Buried it in the mud until I was ready to understand what it meant." "And what does it mean?" Her voice was soft, uncertain. Frank considered the question, thinking about the past 3 weeks of learning to be a single father, of watching his children adapt to their mother's absence with a resilience that broke his heart. He thought about the nearly dry well and the stubborn water that refused to give up, about the crows that stayed even when the landscape couldn't feed them. "It means some things are worth digging for," he said finally, "even when they're buried deeper than you thought possible." Marianne leaned against the bridge railing, her gaze fixed on the moving water below. "I read about the drought in the papers. How are the crops?" "Struggling. But we found water in the well. Not much, but enough to keep us going if we're careful. Tommy rigged up a filtration system, and Sarah's been drawing birds. Says they know something we don't about staying put when everything else is telling you to fly away." A smile tugged at the corner of Marianne's mouth. "That sounds like something she'd say. How is she?" "Really? Missing her mother. But strong. Stronger than I gave her credit for." Frank paused, choosing his words carefully. "She thinks I should tell you that you're not the only one who got lost. That maybe we all did, somewhere between trying to survive and forgetting how to live." Marianne turned to face him, and Frank saw in her eyes the woman he'd fallen in love with 23 years ago. Not the exhausted farmer's wife who'd left 3 weeks ago, but the young bank teller who'd believed in second chances and the power of stubborn love. "I don't know how to come home," she said. "I don't know how to be the person you need me to be." "I don't need you to be anyone but who you are," Frank said. "Scared, uncertain, tired of pretending everything's fine when it's not. I can work with that. We can work with that. What if the farm fails? What if the drought doesn't break? What if we lose everything anyway?" Frank looked down at the creek, watching the water flow around obstacles in its path, always finding a way forward. "Then we'll fail together. And when we're ready, we'll start over together. But we won't disappear into separate silences anymore. We won't let the space between us grow so wide that we forget how to reach each other." Marianne was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the bridge railing. "The diner owner offered me a permanent position. Good wages, health insurance. It would be steady income while the farm recovers." Frank felt something shift inside him, not jealousy or fear, but a recognition that the woman standing beside him had grown during their time apart, had discovered parts of herself that had been buried under 22 years of being half of a couple. "Is that what you want?" "I want to contribute something besides worry," she said. "I want to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. And I want to come home, but not to the same house where we lived like polite strangers. I want to come home to something new, something we build together this time." Frank took her hand, feeling the calluses that had developed during her weeks of waitressing, the strength in her fingers that spoke of work and purpose. "The ring doesn't have to go back on your finger right away," he said. "Maybe it can just exist for a while. A reminder of what we're working toward instead of what we're trying to get back." "A promise instead of a prison," Marianne said, understanding immediately. "Exactly." They stood together on the bridge, watching the water flow beneath them, each lost in their own thoughts about the future. Frank thought about the conversation he'd had with Tommy the night before, about converting part of the barn into a workshop space where Sarah could pursue her art. He thought about the sustainable farming techniques he'd been researching, ways to work with the land instead of against it. He thought about marriage not as a destination but as a daily choice, a commitment to showing up even when showing up was hard. "There's something else," Marianne said, her voice tentative. "I've been thinking about what the farm could be besides just corn and soybeans. The land behind the house, where my herb garden used to be. What if we turned it into something bigger? A market garden, maybe. Vegetables, herbs, flowers. Something that doesn't require as much water but still produces something beautiful." Frank smiled, remembering the woman who'd once transformed a patch of weeds into a thriving garden with nothing but determination and faith in growing things. "I think that sounds like exactly the kind of new beginning we need." As they walked back toward the diner, Frank felt the first drops of rain on his face, not the heavy downpour that would break the drought, but the gentle beginning of weather changing, of the earth's promise to provide for those patient enough to wait for it. Marianne squeezed his hand. "I'll give my notice tomorrow. Come home on Sunday, if that's all right. I need a few days to prepare." "Sunday's perfect," Frank said. "Sarah's been planning a welcome-home dinner since she found your letter. Nothing fancy, just pot roast and the kind of conversation we used to have before we forgot how to talk to each other." "I'd like that," Marianne said. "I'd like that very much." Frank drove home through the gentle rain, the wedding ring in his pocket and hope in his chest for the first time in months. When he pulled into the farmyard, he saw Tommy and Sarah waiting on the front porch, their faces expectant. He held up his hand, showing them the ring, and Sarah's whoop of joy carried across the fields like a promise of better days ahead. That night, as the rain continued to fall on the parched earth, Frank placed the ring on the kitchen windowsill where it caught the light from the lamp. Not on anyone's finger yet, but present, a symbol of commitment renewed, of love that was deeper than the surface troubles that had threatened to drown it. The well was nearly dry, but not empty. The crops were struggling, but not dead. The marriage was damaged, but not beyond repair. And sometimes, Frank thought as he listened to the rain on the roof and the sound of his children's laughter from the living room, nearly was enough to start with. If Frank Lawson's story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the strength that lives in ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, or if it sparked hope in your own corner of the world, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that even the deepest wells can still hold water. Subscribe to our channel. We tell stories that heal, inspire, and prove that love, like the land itself, has the power to endure even the longest droughts. Until next time, never stop believing in the power of digging deeper when everything else tells you to give up.